Hello, welcome back to the Praying Christian Women podcast. I am Alana here with Jamie. How are you?
I am doing great. How about you?
I am good. If I'm doing my mental math right, you are probably listening to this episode the week that our book is live. So if you haven't grabbed it yet, She Prays Like a Girl should be available not just for pre-order, but for reading. And we are so excited. And today we're going to be continuing our discussion about the way that our womanhood shapes our prayers. And this has been such a fun type of topic to talk about and explore.
Yeah, I love how a couple of the times we've started talking about things and kind of veered off in a different direction because there's just so much to talk about. It's been fun.
It really has. So before we dive really deep, what are some things? I know that it's kind of vogue to complain about different things about being a woman. My favorite thing to complain about is they never give us pockets in any of our clothes, and when they do, they're way too small. But aside from that, what's something you love about being a woman? What is something you love about your womanhood?
I love I love a lot of things, I think. Well, most recently, I've enjoyed just doing kind of girly things with our daughter. Like
Mm-hmm.
I have liked just doing I never have been like what you would consider a girly girl. Like
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. I just wasn't I've never been into some of the things like, the stereotypical girly girl loves to go shopping, loves to do
Mm-hmm.
makeup and hair, and I've
Yeah.
always that those are not always my priorities, but I've enjoyed kind of exploring girly girl things with our daughter, who also was not much of a girly girl. And we moved
Mm-hmm.
here, and a couple of her friends are into like nails and
Mm-hmm.
perfume and hair and stuff. And so she's been kind of getting into some of those things. So she's been doing my nails. And so,
Cute.
yeah, I wish I could show you, but they actually came off. But she's been doing these gel nails. So she gave me talons on one hand to
Oh,
the point where
funny.
yesterday I couldn't even hardly type. I was trying to get work done, and I was grateful when two of them broke because,
Aw.
anyway, yeah, she does this like gel stuff. But so I've kind of enjoyed that aspect of being a woman, just
Mhm.
enjoying it with my daughter. Um,
Yeah.
but I would say like the biggest consistent thing is that I've come to love about being a woman is the emotional vulnerability that comes with my hormonal fluctuations. And
Oh,
that was
wow.
not always that was not always the case. I used to dread those kinds of vulnerabilities, and
Hmm.
but I have learned to love it because what I have found is when I am more emotionally, I guess I will call it emotionally fragile. That sounds negative,
Okay.
but when I'm more emotionally fragile, I feel the veil between the physical and the spiritual thinning. And I feel
Hmm.
like I'm more receptive to God. I'm more needy because my physical self is, the scripture that says, while outwardly we're wasting away,
Yeah.
inwardly we're strengthening. And so I just feel like as I physically and emotionally become less, that spiritually I need God more. And
Hmm.
so I guess I don't need God more. I realize the extent to which I need God because I don't have the crutch of
Hmm.
stability and self-sufficiency that I would have otherwise. So
Interesting.
I feel like I worship in a way that I've learned to embrace. So when I'm feeling emotionally fragile, when I'm feeling even angry, like I'm thinking more along the lines of anxiety or feeling sad or, things like that. But even anger,
Hmm.
like yesterday, I had kind of a moment of hormonal just all at once out of the like almost like anger and rage over something really small
Hmm.
happened, and I kind of chalked it up to hormonal stuff going on. But I need God so desperately in those moments. And so I've gotten to the point where I'm just like, oh, I can't stand this. And then I think, okay, God, you can get me through this. And it drives me to him in a way that not a lot of things do. So,
Interesting. Well, this might take our episode in a whole new direction if you're open for it.
sure. How about you though? Answer the question.
Well, I was just thinking what you were talking about, and then if you help me remember, I'll go back to answer about just womanhood in general.
Hmm.
But I know one thing that I appreciate about like being a woman who has a menstrual cycle is I find that each day my period starts is kind of a really nice reminder of it's almost like having a mini New Year's once a month. It's like, okay, new me, new start, so maybe I haven't been eating well, or maybe I've just been really grumpy. It's kind of like, hey, I get a new start today. I definitely appreciate that side of it for sure.
Yeah, I've actually kind of come to see my when because I've stopped cycling regularly, and
Mhm.
just FYI, if you're a too much information kind of person and you're listening, this might get into
This
the
isn't
weeds.
your episode.
This might not be your episode, but I'm no longer cycling like clockwork, like up until about, I don't know, 6 or 7 years ago. Probably when I turned around 41 is when my
Mhm.
cycle was hijacked by hormones and
Mhm.
perimenopause. Up to that point, I would say all but just a few handful of months. My cycle was 28 days long. Every 20 I could set my calendar by it,
Mhm.
and if it changed, I was just really either thought I was pregnant or but or something was wrong. And so
Mhm.
it went from that to I never know when I'm going to have one now. It could be 80 days was the longest I've gone without one. 14 days has been the
Oh
shortest. And
man.
yeah, so that was weird. And but for the most part it's in the range of like probably 20 days all the way up to like 60 or 80 days. I never know.
Mhm.
But I can sort of tell based on other signs kind of where I'm at and maybe kind of project what's going to
Mhm.
happen. But I I just kind of never know what's going to happen at any given time.
Yeah.
And I forget where I was going with that. Do you remember what I started off saying in the beginning?
We were basically, it was like, what do you love about womanhood? And then you were talking about
Oh,
going
right. So
from
you were
regular
saying it's a
cycles.
reminder. So it's a reminder of womanhood and a new start. And for
Hmm.
me, though, it has become every time I have the first day of my period,
Hmm.
I kind of cling to it for dear life because I have some baggage with, I have come to associate menopause with dementia because my mom
Yeah.
went through menopause early, like in her early 40s, and
Hmm.
she never really recovered from it, I don't think, emotionally and mentally. And it was in her late 50s that she was diagnosed with dementia. So it was, to me, I look at that and I think, well, every time I have a period, that means, and there's this idea that estrogen might be protective for your brain.
Hmm.
And so I kind of look at it as, oh, phew, one more month of sanity.
Hmm.
And I know that's the wrong view. It's not the good
Yeah.
view, but I have started to kind of associate it with that, which kind of goes along with this idea that, well, menopause is evil and the
Hmm.
baggage surrounding perimenopause and menopause,
Right.
which is maybe why I kind of writing this book kind of helped me to embrace some of the benefits of just looking at reflecting on times in my life when I've been more emotionally fragile and
Hmm.
definitely hormonally compromised that have had benefits. So I think that's been a benefit of writing this book has been embracing that and
Yeah.
getting rid of some of that baggage that I, still carry a little bit of it though.
Yeah. Well, we think about girls going through puberty and, being on this emotional roller coaster. And even as adult women, like the other reason I kind of feel that sense of relief when I get my period is it's like, oh, that explains so much, right?
Right.
It's like, that explains why all day yesterday I just felt like I was the worst person in the world. That explains why I've
Right.
been eating the way I've been eating.
Mhm.
It explains now it's to the point like, oh, that explains why my joints are doing what they're doing. It's just a
Yeah.
sense of, oh, like all of these things that I feel like are part of me. No, that's just stuff that's happening to me because of my hormones. And now we're getting a reset. So that's another
Hmm.
kind of side I like about it. But this idea of like, I bet that there's not a single woman listening who would voluntarily go through puberty again just for the experience, right?
Right.
It's hard. There's so many hard things. And you talk about being vulnerable, like you are so vulnerable. Socially, it's when girls can be like at their worst. It can be when your self-esteem is at its lowest. In some families, it's like the daughter's going through puberty while the mom's going through menopause. So there's hormones fluctuating, there's emotions all up and down. It can feel very chaotic. It can feel very, very scary. There is something beautiful, though, about being able to tap into our emotions, right? Like if you get to where you're kind of tracking your emotional state during your cycle, and let's just all pick like your very best emotional day, right? It might be like right in the middle. You're nowhere near PMS and you're nowhere near having just started your period. And maybe you feel like, ooh, if I could be that way every single day, life would just be amazing. But there is something beautiful about being able to cycle through things. And I feel like
Hmm.
it's a difference between stagnant water and flowing stream or river. And when it's flowing, things are getting cleaned out, right? And things are getting flushed out. And so, in a way, a cycle can even help you like flush through emotional processes. And we want to recognize that not every woman's going to have the same experience. I'm not as PMSy as some women get. My periods have always been a little irregular, and some women don't have periods at all. Some people don't have a typical hormone cycle. Some are postmenopause. Some have had, hysterectomies. Some are on hormone replacement. We get that there are so many different places to be in this, but there is a gift in this kind of cycling through even just your emotional state, right? That's, I think, kind of why I like that day one is kind of like, okay, clean. Brand new month, new me kind of thing.
Yeah, it is an opportunity for kind of that. I've heard people in the secular space talk about doing either with your cycle or with like lunar cycles, choosing like is it the full moon or the new moon? Like there's
Usually
like
a new moon.
a new moon
Hmm.
ritual of,
Hmm.
assessing your life and
It's
kind of
just a new start.
right, a
Hmm.
new start. And, your cycle is typically, I mean, it is tied to the lunar phases. I mean, it
Hmm.
doesn't necessarily, but I believe, and I don't want to speak out of turn because I'm not a scientist or anything, but I'm pretty sure that the gravitational pull of the moon, which affects the tides, also affects our hormonal cycles and fluctuations, which
Hmm.
is,
Hmm.
kind of why, like, it would, in the long time ago, they would call it like your moon blood or
Hmm.
something like that because
Yeah.
it seemed to kind of coordinate with. So,
Hmm.
what I think of sometimes with my cycle is just this idea of connection to God's creation and the
Hmm.
interconnectedness of everything that He's made,
Yeah.
including my body, which is crazy.
Hmm. Yeah.
Obviously, it's affected by other things too, but.
No, I absolutely get that. I remember in high school, my window was always right where the moon rose. And then in college, I was walking outside so often. I had a good like 8 year span of time where I could have always told you what phase of the moon we were in. And there is something nice about just its predictability. I think it's a picture we have of God's faithfulness. It's a picture we have of seasons of rest and seasons of work, seasons of light, seasons of dark, like Ecclesiastes, a time for everything. And when I got pretty disoriented for the first couple years after that, I'm like, I don't know what the moon's doing, And now I only
Hmm.
notice it if it's real abnormal. Like last night, I saw a really interesting sliver of a moon that was kind of
Mhm.
lit up in orange. Like I noticed it, but there was something very stabilizing about just always knowing, right? I
Yeah.
remember after we got out of the NICU, I had an entire like year to 15 months where I was so disoriented, I wasn't connected to the months and the seasons. So
Yeah.
if you said, like, oh, yeah, my kid's birthday is in February, I wouldn't know. It wasn't that I forgot the date. It would be like I would have no sense of, is that coming up? Has that just happened? And there is something that grounds us when we have these cycles, day and night, new moon, full moon, even the seasons that change. And the more we get into our post-industrial world, the more removed we get from that, kind of like me
Yeah.
these days, not really knowing what the moon's up to. Or part of what made the NICU so disorienting was like we had weeks where we barely left, like never went outside, right? Because we
Right.
were living in the hospital grounds.
Yeah.
And the fact that we have electricity and heat and things like that means that we're not as and we're not all farming. It means that we're not as tied to the seasons of the year either. And all of
Hmm.
these things are meant to teach us that we're not supposed to do on the winter solstice the kind of stuff we're doing on the summer solstice. Like that's not how God designs the rhythm of humanity. But when you work a 9 to 5 job, that's what you're doing, whether it's daylight all the time. And a gift of being in Alaska is we do have these extreme weathers and extreme shifts in daylight. So I think we do notice it a lot more, like so
Hmm.
much more. And it is
Yeah.
a gift. There is something that grounds us. Which hymn is it? Summer and winter, springtime and harvest, sun, moon, and stars and their
Great is thy
courses above.
faithfulness.
And
Yeah.
it's just a reminder that just like the sun always rises, just like spring always comes after winter, God has given us all of these reminders of that. And yeah, I think like we've obviously God made humanity with a circadian rhythm that matches like the 24-hour daylight cycle. I think he's also given us specifically as women, this kind of, in my case, 28-ish day, or sometimes not even
Hmm.
ish, but we have these cycles to just kind of remind us of the flow of life. Everything's moving. Things aren't meant to stay stagnant. We don't need
Oh,
to do every single, Monday what we do on every single Saturday. We don't need to do every single August what we do every single November, right? There are shifts in our life. There are seasons of life, and I think that's a beautiful gift God has given us.
yeah. And even in the Old Testament, I mean, the Jewish tradition is full of new moon festivals
Yeah.
and festivals of different, seasons and things like that.
Hmm.
And in Genesis, it talks about specifically that the stars and the planets and the moon and the sun are to mark seasons, to mark time.
Hmm.
And God
Hmm.
didn't have to do that. Like I think
Right.
about that, just like we talked about last week in last week's episode about prayer. And God didn't have to involve us. We didn't have to be
Yes.
vessels
Hmm.
of prayer. God didn't have to give us these cycles and seasons. And so what can be learned from those things? And, how can we take meaning away from them and, I don't know, press into them?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Well, let's open up in prayer, and then I'll ask you after that, do you want to talk more about kind of the hormones and how they influence our prayer life? Or do you want to move on and just do more broad discussion about different aspects of womanhood and how that impacts our prayers?
Oh, that's a good question. I mean, I guess this would be a good segue into talking about hormones, but
Okay.
I don't know. Yeah.
It's a really interesting one. I know it's been kind of on our slate to chat about, but I also know that like, are you ready or do you need a little bit of preparation time to get it going?
I think this would be a good opportunity to kind of go into hormones and just cycles and whether you're a cycling person or not in terms of hormones. We all have seasons of life and cycles of life that,
Hmm.
we need to be more mindful of. So that might be a good segue.
Perfect. Well, why don't you open us up in prayer and then we can jump right in.
Okay. God, we just thank you for womanhood. Thank you for creating us so intricately and so specifically. We thank you for cycles of life, for the seasons, for just the mystery of change. We just pray that you would help us to kind of look within ourselves and look at, I don't know, to be able to embrace the different seasons of life, the different cycles of our lives as women. And instead of fighting against them, that we would be able to look into them and kind of ride the wave of the cycles of our lives so that we can connect with you more authentically, so that we can see the strengths in even the things that we don't like about our cyclical selves and of the cycles and seasons of life, and just lean into those and draw closer to you through them, and even be able to give you thanks in the midst of them. We just pray that you would be glorified during this time, and we just pray that you would help each one of us to glean what it is that you have for us today through this discussion. Amen.
So before we dive really deep into our discussion about how hormones do impact our health, our mood, and that obviously impacts our prayer lives, I also want to just raise awareness about a prayer burden that some people might choose to start interceding for. And that is for women who are living in cultures where like menstruation is still seen. Like there are some places where like a girl on her period's not allowed to go to school.
Right.
Or I heard like do you know the history of the suicide hotline?
No.
I guess there was a girl who started her period and she thought that meant that somehow she had lost her virginity or something like that. And she felt so ashamed that she killed herself. And the person who heard about that was so saddened by her story. That's what that led him to start this hotline that people could call. Or other, in some cultures, girls are taught that like anybody who has a period has an STD or things like that. And so there are definitely some families where it's just like kind of not talked about. There are some families where it's actually celebrated, which I think is beautiful. You know, if we had a daughter who started her period, I would love to find a beautiful way to celebrate that with her, and not make her like totally embarrassed by it. But you know, some like maybe not invite, you know, her dad and brothers and you know and stuff and call grandpa if she didn't want them to. But you know, to let her know this is something beautiful. It's something like I don't ring a bell, but I don't want my sons to be shocked if they hear me talk about my period or things like that. You know, like when I need to go and buy sanitary products, I don't, you know, like, and they're with me. I put it in my cart and I make sure to not make it weird, right? And I think that these are all
Mm-hmm.
things that we can do. So we've got some people who just maybe don't talk about it, which is kind of how I grew up. We have some people who celebrate it, but there are women in certain places who are horrified by it or are very much made to feel ashamed by it or things like that. And that is a prayer burden that could definitely become a reason to start interceding if that's something God lays on your heart.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, you know, in our book, we have a whole chapter dedicated to just basically how our hormonal cycles can impact our prayer lives. And more than that, like how our hormonal cycles can be harnessed instead of
Mm-hmm.
fought against. And I just
Yeah.
think that's so important because kind of like I said before, in many ways, I've kind of rebelled against my hormones not acting in the way that I think they should.
Mhm.
And I've learned to kind of embrace I've used this example before, but like jujitsu, which
Yes.
is like using the energy of someone else to do what you want to do, like to deflect them
Mm-hmm.
or to gain the upper hand. But to do that, to be able to, I don't know, not the word like, biohacking, but like to hack your
No, I
hormonal
think that that's a
cycle,
good way to look at it.
a
Yeah.
hormonal hack, yeah, to be able to hack your cycle and to be able to, what it really involves, I think, though, is because everyone's cycle is different and not everyone even cycles
Mhm.
normally or regularly, but we all have things going on in our bodies at any given time. And to be in tune, I think that's what it boils down to, being in
Mhm.
tune with what your body's doing. And in doing that, to have grace with yourself when necessary,
Mhm.
to capitalize on energy when you have it, and
Yes.
also to be cautioned not to overdo things just because for the moment you're feeling really good.
Exactly. Yeah. Well, and I think that this is so key. So we can make this tied to any type of cycle and not just the typical hormones, which,
Yeah,
probably is only going to pertain to like 50% of our listeners, depending
right.
on, age, health status, and all of that. So
Hmm.
I like to think we can even start with something like your circadian rhythm, right? And we
Hmm.
all have different peaks in our energy, right? Are you a morning person? Are you a night person? That's going to tell you, like, you can biohack that into when should you pray best. If you think that you've got to pray first thing in the morning, and it leaves you like super grouchy and disoriented for the whole day, your experience with praying in the morning is gonna be totally different than the person who loves waking up in the morning and just jumping into prayer time. So, one of the cycles we can talk about is ask yourself when in the day is your best time for the things that God has given you to do. And obviously, some of them, like we can't change our work schedule, like when our workday starts necessarily. If you're just working for somebody, you can't change the day that your kid's school day starts unless you happen to be the superintendent of their district and have the backing of everybody else. But in as much as you can, ask yourself, okay, when does it make sense for all the things that I want to get done today? Maybe the way you're doing it is actually like the exact opposite. Maybe it makes the most sense to like wake up and dive into the house chores and to pray in the afternoon and to exercise at night. And you've been trying to do it like all backwards or
Hmm.
something like that. There are lots of different ways. And again, it comes into being curious about it, recognizing that just because one person sets up her schedule one way doesn't mean that that's how your schedule should be set up. And then really leaning into how does my body feel at this moment and how can I capitalize on that? So that's an example in terms of just 24-hour rhythms. We also have examples of like the seasons of the year, right? I started tracking my word count back when I was writing, like every single day I was working on like novel after novel after novel. I would track my word count every day and I would compare that month over month. And after a couple years of data, I realized, okay, January and February are always going to be lower word output months.
Oh, wow. That is really interesting.
And so if we're to February 20th and I'm feeling sluggish, I'm not going to beat myself up and say, why aren't you writing like you did last June? Because last June we were getting 24 hours of sunlight and I was feeling great and I was getting fresh air every single day. And in February, we're not getting anything close to that. So recognizing even seasonally, or maybe you have a cycle that's tied to an anniversary date, right? Maybe there's an anniversary date of the death of a loved one that every time that comes around, you just know you're not going to be at your peak. Instead of beating yourself up, just accept that into the natural flow. Kind of like if you're the type of woman who has a really hard couple PMS days and you know you've got to just kind of make allowances for yourself or change your schedule, go ahead and do that when you come across this anniversary or things like that. And it teaches you to go with the cycle instead of fighting against it, right? So like let's say I don't know enough about like swimming or surfing or ocean tides, but I get the fact that going against the tide is going to do nothing but drain your energy, right? Whereas when you learn to like let the tide work with you, you can, I don't know what you can do, but it's probably more impressive than when you're always trying to fight the tide. And so learning how to be on this, and let's not call it a roller coaster because that sounds kind of scary, I really like the idea of the tide. Like it can be relaxing. Did you and I feel like, did we ever go to H2 Oasis to their river walk in Anchorage?
I don't remember. I went a few times because I had one of our kids did swimming lessons and I would take the
Okay.
other one and walk the river, but we might have done it
I
together.
sort of feel like
I
maybe
feel
we
like we
did
did
once.
because I sort of remember our little ones were with us
Yeah.
and then,
And
yeah.
so it's this water park in Anchorage. It is absolutely disgusting. If you're planning a vacation to Anchorage, like please don't go. It is so gross.
The
But
kids used to always want to go there and it was expensive and it was disgusting.
disgusting. But it had this river walk
They will not be
where
sponsoring this episode of
they
the
sure
Praying Christian
won't.
Women podcast.
But you could either, just kind of float on a tube and just kind of go in this little circle, or if you felt like getting your exercise, like you and I think we would walk against the flow, right? Isn't that the idea? So it's almost like you get a little
Right, so you get to
more
go against it to get
workout.
resistance and
Yeah.
you're walking against the
Yeah.
current and it was
So
yeah.
it's this idea of, okay, the current's going to be there. Our hormones are going to ebb and flow. Our seasons of life are going to ebb and flow. We can either work really hard against that, like you and me trying to get our exercise in by walking against the flow, or
Hmm.
we can do what our kids did and just sit in the inner tube and just kind of go with it. And that's kind of the picture we want to share. So, Jamie, you happen to be dubbed the praying Christian women hormonal expert. So, can you talk about just for the typical hormonal flow for women who do menstruate? Can you kind of talk through just the different parts of that
Phases.
phase and how that can impact our prayers?
Yes. And I do want to do a disclaimer. I am not an expert and I'm not a medical professional. And so what I have gained, I've gleaned from kind of my own curiosity into my own
Mhm.
cycle. And so I just want to give that disclaimer that before
Mhm.
you take anything that I say as gospel, go check it out yourself and
Yeah.
reference it yourself. There are plenty of references, though, to phases of your hormonal cycle. But basically, like in the book, when I talk about sort of the different phases, I kind of simplify it because there's so many different hormones and different versions of hormones, but I just kind of break it down into estrogen, progesterone, and testosterone, which are three of the kind of main hormones that affect different things just to make it a little bit more palatable. But basically, you have like four different cycles, four different phases of your
Phases.
cycle. And so the first phase is the menstrual phase. That's when it starts the first day that you have your period and it goes until the last day that you bleed, which is arbitrary because you kind of, it's
Mhm.
it's just kind of in that range. So basically, while you're menstruating is the menstrual, and then you have the next phase after that is the follicular phase, and the follicular phase kind of overlaps with the menstrual phase because technically it begins the day your period starts and it ends the day that your ovary releases an egg at ovulation, which is like roughly 10 to 14 days into your cycle. So they do overlap. But when I say the menstrual phase, I'm talking about your actual period, the days that you're bleeding. The follicular phase, when I talk about that, usually I'm thinking kind of a little bit towards the middle of that. So maybe days like 5 to 14-ish, something like that.
Mhm.
But there is kind of a continuum. And
Mhm.
then there's the ovulatory phase, which is like days 13 to 15, roughly. And that is when your ovary actually releases an egg and it begins to form. Anyway, 13 to 15 is when the egg releases. And then after that is called the luteal phase, where that area where the egg burst out, the follicle, forms a yellow body called the corpus luteum, which literally means yellow body. And that is when luteinizing hormone increases, or I'm sorry, that is when the corpus luteum forms and you are actually post ovulation. So yeah, those are the four stages. And then after that, after the luteal phase, you kind of go back to the menstrual life, the menstrual
Yeah.
cycle. I mean, the
So let's
menstrual
start
phase.
with ovulation because
Yeah.
most people are aware of the day their period starts. And some women are aware when they ovulate. For
Hmm.
anybody really, really interested, if you study natural family planning, even if you don't feel like using it as a birth control method, it does give you a lot of insight into being able to read your body signs of when you're ovulating, things like that. So let's talk about the ovulation
Mhm.
because I think that's a fun place to start in the cycle because often it's where we're feeling maybe at our best, right? If our mood was 100% correlated to our cycles, which it's not, there's so many other things that play into it. But if it was 100% tied to a menstrual cycle, I would say ovulation is probably when you're going to feel the best. Would you say that's pretty, would you agree with that?
Yeah, I think so. Typically, that's what
Hmm.
people will say is you're kind of at the height of good feelings, of energy, of, all of the
Yeah,
things when you're in your ovulatory, I mean, when you're like
when you're
ovulation, yeah,
ovulating. And
ovulating.
let's go ahead and give the science behind it. That is because when you ovulate, those are your most fertile windows. And so it would make sense that you are feeling at your best then. It's when you might be feeling the most romantic. It's when you might be feeling the most likely, I want to go out tonight. Sure, I want to go to this party, even though usually I love staying at home. Interestingly, they have done studies that women are, I think you're the one who told me this, women are more likely to buy like clothes and cosmetics
Yes.
when they
Yes.
ovulate. So
Yeah.
we are more concerned about our appearance. None of this is something to be ashamed of. Like this is a way that God makes sure that when a woman is at her most fertile, she is also like feeling the most up to engaging in activities that will result in a baby. We'll just leave it at that.
Yeah.
And so, yes, it would be great to say, "Oh, I like this window of my cycle. Why couldn't God have just made this my status quo every single day of my life?" What would be some of your, if you had to come up with a couple explanations, why don't you think God, why is it better for us to not live at that peak indefinitely, assuming that it didn't impact anything like our fertility? Why didn't God just give us this gift of always feeling like that?
I mean, you could go into kind of the, like the primal reproductive reasons of
Hmm.
maybe there's something about that highlight of energy and of pheromone release and of
Hmm.
caring for yourself that, just kind of aids in reproduction and furthering
Uh-huh.
the species. But in
Hmm.
terms of just every day, I think it's kind of like if you always felt that way, you would just always be in whatever gear. Let's say you're in
Yeah,
in, in high gear, you
absolutely.
would always be
Hmm.
in high gear. You might be tempted to just always be going and not
Hmm.
have a pullback and a respite and a reflective period
Hmm.
of your
Hmm.
period or your life,
No, that
but
makes a ton of sense.
I feel like it's almost like if you think about like say your birthday, and
Hmm.
on your birthday people celebrate you, they might give you gifts, they
Hmm.
might tell you how important you are to them, and it makes it really special. It's a day that you look forward to the whole
Hmm.
year, and when you get to your birthday it's like, okay, I'm this day is special. And I think with the
Hmm.
ovulatory phase, it's special in some ways, and it wouldn't be as, I don't think you would be as ready for it or at your peak if you didn't have those other lower energy or lower times
Hmm. Yeah.
to be able to gather up rest. I mean, to
To gather
rest
rest, I think is
and
really
to
important.
gather.
Hmm.
Yeah, I guess so.
Yeah, there are stages in your cycle where a woman is primed to want to be more by herself, right?
Mhm.
It's like, no, I don't feel good right now. I want to stay home. And kind of like summer and winter. Like what I dislike is when people say, well, I like winter because it makes me appreciate summer. To me, there's a little bit too much of just martyrdom in that and be like, well, why can't I just appreciate summer? But
Right, or discounting winter as
exactly,
invaluable so that, oh,
exactly.
the doldrums of winter will
Right.
contrast to the greatness of. Summer.
It's like the girl who only wants to go clubbing with like her quote ugly friend so that she looks prettier. Like, well, that's not nobody wants to be friends in that kind of scenario.
That's a
And
good
so
point.
what I love about winter, it is an invitation to rest, right?
Hmm.
And we can look at the beginning of our cycle as an invitation for rest. It is a time when many, but not all couples are more abstinent. That can be beneficial for a relationship. That can be beneficial. Maybe you're focusing more on communication or things like that. Or maybe it just kind of is that kind of breathing room. Oh, don't have to go anywhere tonight kind of feel. So yeah, it's easy to find the pros relation. I'm going to throw a harder question at you. What are some of the benefits of being on your period for your prayer life or just your life in general?
I think it's kind of, when you're on your period, your hormones are such that you're more, like I said before, in general, emotionally fragile. You
Hmm.
might find the days, either the short days leading up to your period or the first few days of your period, you might really find PMS isn't always all pre. Some of it is
Right,
very
right.
much during the first few
Hmm.
days. You might be feeling lower energy. I personally get a little bit anemic during my period. Like I would give blood regularly when I was younger before kids, and
Hmm.
I started to notice they would decline me sometimes because my
Hmm.
hematocrit was too low and
Yeah.
I didn't have enough iron. And so you're kind of lower on energy, you're emotionally a little more fragile. And I think that forces us to take time for ourselves.
Yeah.
And if we don't do that, I think that's why so many of us hate it because we fight
Hmm.
against it and we're
Yeah.
trying so hard to be just as productive, just like you with winter and
Right.
writing.
Right.
Our expectations for ourselves are the same every single day,
Hmm.
and they can't be because we're
Right.
not necessarily going to be up to the same things. So, one of the
Yeah.
benefits I see for me is I know, and it's not making excuses for yourself to be realistic. So,
Hmm.
for instance, I know that I probably don't want to have a really in depth, like, let's define the relationship with my husband and
Hmm.
let's talk about these deep
Hmm.
problems when I'm that emotionally fragile.
Yeah.
During those times, I might need to be a little bit more removed, a little bit more stable to have some of those conversations. However, I do know, and what I've come to find is my worship, like when I'm in church worshiping or when I'm in my prayer closet praying, during those times of menstruation, I feel like I'm able to be more present with God and more vulnerable with God, more attuned maybe to what He's saying to me.
Yeah.
And so I can capitalize on that. But I do
Hmm.
think that it can be a benefit if you don't have the same rigid expectations for yourself that you have the
Yeah.
rest of the cycle,
Hmm.
to
Hmm.
take a step back and to be more restful and to
Yeah.
require less of yourself and expect less of yourself in certain
Hmm.
areas.
Yeah, I think it's an invitation to rest. It's an invitation to be more introspective. I also love it as just kind of that day one, right? That new start.
Hmm.
So if you've had a hard time, maybe you're trying to cut back on your coffee, or do you know what I mean? Like you're trying to break a bad habit and you're feeling frustrated with yourself. I encourage you to always look at like cycle day one. Oh, good. I get a fresh start. And yes, technically we can have that every single moment before God, which is wonderful. But to me, this is a just a physical reminder. I'm new. And there's even a sense of, I think when you're on your period, especially kind of that first day, it can turn into a reminder to do some in the same way that the Old Testament law prescribed certain type of ritualistic washing regarding your
Hmm.
menstruation. There can be a sense of releasing, like sloughing off, the stress from last cycle, or sloughing off the bad habit you're trying to get rid of, or sloughing off the sin that you know you need to confess, having it be a reminder of the cleanliness that we have before God. Because sometimes, like when you're on your period, you don't feel super clean always,
Hmm.
you might be a little more self-conscious about that kind of stuff. So it can also be a reminder, like we are cleansed by God. And I would just encourage everybody, especially like if you're raising daughters, like do whatever you can to not make it feel like a dirty period, right? Like
Hmm.
that's why I don't I don't ring a gong, but I don't want to be embarrassed if my kids know that I'm on my period, because I don't want my boys to grow up thinking that cycles are dirty or that kind of thing either. But I do like it as an invitation to just kind of, yeah, start anew. When I took voice lessons for a little bit in high school. And apparently, are you familiar with how your cycle impacts a woman's singing voice?
No, no, I
Fun
haven't heard
tidbit,
that.
which anecdotally I absolutely believe is true. You
Hmm.
sing a lot better the day right before your period, to the
Really?
extent that now that I'm singing regularly in church, that is sometimes how I know that it's coming. I
Wow.
don't know the science behind it. I'm like, well, that's kind of a fun gift, because sometimes we don't see a ton of perks about
Hmm.
being on your period or about, the days leading up to your period. But that's definitely one. Another one I think is almost an emotional reset.
Yeah.
Like I wasn't PMSing, but I had a really big cry a couple days ago.
Hmm.
And I'm not a typical crier, like, a couple times a year tends to be about my schedule, but there was such a sense of emotional release
Yes.
afterward, and so it's just okay, I got all of this stress out. Just
Hmm.
like I'm getting this old egg out. There can
Hmm.
be an emotional reset. And sometimes when you are feeling more emotional, instead of being embarrassed by that, like lean into it. Watch that movie that you know is going to make you cry because you know you're going to feel better after you get that emotional release. There's nothing wrong with that.
Yeah, I just love this idea because you really do tend to be more introspective and more, I don't know, attuned with your emotions
Mm-hmm.
during
Mm-hmm.
your menstrual phase. And I just love the idea of making a ritual around
Yeah.
kind of assessing, maybe assess your prayer life and
Mm-hmm.
and go to God with that and, think talk with God about your prayer life. Maybe not, maybe you don't have the energy
Mm-hmm.
to fight
Dive into the deep
major
prayer.
spiritual battles
Mm-hmm.
or, fabricate extensive prayer lists, but to go to God and just on a very visceral, like emotional level,
Mm-hmm.
like where can I be praying more? What are the
Yeah.
things that move me to emotion?
Yeah.
Discovering prayer burdens is something that you could probably do during that phase
Or going
because
to Psalms for me. Psalms is where I'll
oh yeah.
go. Yeah, when I want that introspective time with God, me and my emotions.
Yeah.
It'd be funny if I had a Bible. It would be so funny to track. Like, the correlation between when I'm in Psalms versus where I'm at in my cycle. I'm gonna
Oh,
guess that
that's too
I'm gonna
funny.
guess there's probably a correlation right there.
Very strong correlation.
Yep. Yep. And then so you have your cycle and it's not like and then this day ends and all of a sudden you're a new person, right? Like it's always like this is going up while that's going down. But you menstruate and then you start leading toward ovulation. So you're starting to feel like you're gaining energy, you're getting kind of ramped up. What are some of the biohacks for either just before or just after ovulation? So you're not menstruating, you're not PMSing. What are some of the biohacks for that season?
Well, so as you kind of enter into that follicular phase, it's when the follicle's developing, and just before ovulation is when your estrogen and testosterone kind of peak just prior to that or at the same time in general. And so as you're entering into that phase, a lot of people, the time just before ovulation is just kind of, I don't know, a time where your maybe productivity is your capacity for productivity is increasing.
I like how you put that.
And as you go along, you might find that you're able to accomplish more. You're able
Yeah.
to maybe think more clearly, to maybe,
Mm-hmm.
I don't know, strategize. And if we're talking specifically about our prayer lives, maybe
Mm-hmm.
that would be the time where you have more energy to pour into, creating or praying through prayer lists or,
Mm-hmm.
just doing some of that like hard intercession kind of work
Yeah.
while you have the energy, just capitalizing on that kind of energy to do
Yeah.
that.
Well, and I really like, I love when you explain to me the connection between ovulating and like buying clothes or even buying things to decorate your home, right? And this could be, the closer you are to ovulation on one side or the other, maybe that is a time to pay more attention to the aesthetics. Maybe it's time to work on that like pretty prayer scrapbook or
Mhm.
something like that as well. And then you've got your ovulation period. I love one of the warnings that you give, and she prays like a girl, and that is don't overcommit at this time, because
Mhm.
it is important to remember that you're not always going to feel like you feel on your best day. And so it helps keep us humble to realize I'm feeling great today. Let me be a good steward of the energy I've got today, but also not to overcommit and not to say, ooh, in 17 days, I want to be doing this thing when in 17 days you might be like on the floor with really bad cramps or something.
Right. And I mean, I've been there, and that's why I wrote about it, is because I've been in that situation where I feel really good and you feel like you can conquer the world, and
Mhm.
someone asks a really big ask, and you're like, yeah, I can do that. That's
Mhm.
fine. That'll be great. And then 48 hours later, you're just like, whoa, what did I
Mhm.
just do? And it doesn't mean that you're not going to say yes, but I would just say, especially if you know that you're in that zone of just feeling awesome, just
Mhm.
remember that it's not going to be that way the whole month and the whole, just maybe don't make big decisions or commitments during
Yeah.
that time when you're feeling so good, because it is kind of a fleeting time of, a few
Yeah.
days where you're just at your real
Hmm.
peak,
Right.
probably.
Right.
So,
Well, and I know for me, so like my hormone tide maybe is like this, and my emotion tide is more like this. And so for me, it has more to do with just where I'm at, like seasonally, season affective disorder, depression, vitamins, and all of that. So it makes it less predictable, which is hard. Similarly, if you have more irregular cycles, right? It's not going to be the picture, set your calendar but when you ovulate, and that's going to be the best day to do this. But it's a good reminder to, like, I never try to book myself to 100% capacity compared to my best day, right? And there's a sense of humility that comes when you've got to put some limits on things, and it can help you even be wise about what you choose to spend more of your prayer energy on. Like, wouldn't it be great if we all had 24 hours a day of completely focused time to intercede, but we don't. And so that forces us to be efficient with our prayers. It forces us to selectively choose our prayer burdens. And that can be a gift too, because we recognize, okay, if I know that on certain days I'm going to feel like picture the woman with the very worst PMS symptoms, and it is like clockwork, and she just knows it's coming. Or I know you had some hormonally tied migraines, right? If you just
mhm.
know that a couple days a month you're going to be almost debilitated, there is so much humility that comes from that, because you just kind of know, okay, you need to be efficient with the time that you do have where you are feeling good, and you need to be a good steward of that. But it also means you get to be gentle with yourself during those other times, because you know that God's not expecting the same output from you on those days.
Yeah, and I think that's the power in being in tune, is just being able to have grace with yourself and knowing that whether it's talking about a menstrual cycle or talking about seasons of your life or seasons
Hmm.
of whatever, that you're not always going to be at the same levels. And so
Yeah,
you can have different expectations for yourself based on how you're feeling, and give yourself permission not to
yeah,
always be the same. And that's actually good, because
yeah,
there are different facets of who you are that are at their peak at all these different times.
right. So I would say, especially if you're feeling discouraged about the season you're in, I would ask God to show you what in
Mm,
that season are the bonuses, right? Because
Right.
even so, I'm going to give you the hardest question of all of them. You're at your very, very worst PMS, like worst PMS symptoms that any woman experience, the cramps, the migraines, the anything and everything. What might be a plus for that woman on a day like that?
I would say, kind of like I was talking about before, just number one, if you have that ability to determine that you're not in at your peak ability,
Mhm.
just the ability to set boundaries. The
Yeah.
like you have to become better at setting boundaries for yourself around your
Hmm.
time, around
Hmm.
your inner critic, and just saying, you know what,
Yeah.
I'm not gonna be hard on myself today because
Hmm.
I can't, because I need time to rest. I find that it's also a time of deep humility sometimes for those of us that
Hmm.
feel like the world is going to stop when we can't do what we can do. I mean, if I have a migraine that's got me laid up, I
Hmm.
realize that my family can do a lot more for themselves than
Yeah.
I ever thought possible.
And there is humility in that, right? Like
There's
so much.
humility in
Yeah.
that. There's so much pride tied up in I'm the only one that can do this. I'm
Yeah.
the only one that can facilitate this. And
Yes.
to realize the world goes on without you
Yeah.
is a huge
So
bonus.
humbling.
Mhm. And also just your reliance on God for everything. And the reminder,
Hmm.
another real bonus, which doesn't come till after sometimes, but I find that when I get a really bad migraine, coming off of that migraine, I have like euphoria because it's like kind of a Christmas Carol moment where I've got
Yeah.
this Ebenezer Scrooge complex of,
Hmm.
oh my goodness, I have a second chance. Look at all the things I can
Yeah.
do now that I took for granted when I was laid up in
Right.
bed.
Right.
So I think there are a lot of things that could be good that kind of come out of those
Yeah.
difficult times.
No, I love that. I think too, we could talk about this in terms of like seasons of aging. Like there were some great things about being in your 20s. That doesn't mean I want to go back to being in my 20s,
Hmm.
but I mean, amazing energy, really good fitness levels without having to work for it. Yes, please. There were amazing things about being in my 30s, right? Like that's when I started writing so much and like just a lot of capacity to get a lot done. I'm 41 now, and like last year was really, really rough. And so I am looking forward for God to show me like the beautiful things about being in my 40s. And one of the things, this is actually going back to our opening question, like, what do you love about being a woman? I love being a woman who's no longer considered a young woman because I do feel respect from others. Like when I walk into the school, everybody knows me because my husband teaches there, right? And so, like, they hold the door open for me, they say hi to me. I love, and so many women are going to think I'm insane. I kind of like getting ma'amed in the grocery store. Like to me, that's a sign of respect. It means like, yeah, you understand that I am not like fresh off the what do they call it, the turnip truck or whatever that saying is. Do you know what I mean? Like
I do.
I've
I can't remember, but yeah.
yeah, and I'm certainly don't consider myself old by any means, but I do recognize like there are some beautiful things about this age, and I'm looking forward to discovering more. So you've been in your 40s for a little longer than I have. What do you love specifically about your 40s?
So I'll tell you first before I tell you what I love about it. So
Uh-huh.
I'm 48 and I got ma'amed in the grocery store last night and
Uh-huh.
I was I just thought, what's wrong with me? Oh my gosh, do I look old? And it's silly. That is so silly. But I don't know. Like I just I it was just weird
Do you
and
know what I think of it as? And
yeah.
anybody is welcome to use this as their hack. I almost think about it as the same as being called like your highness. Like I truly
Okay.
do. I
Like
truly think about it.
ma'am.
Yeah, as in like, oh, you deserve respect. Like you're a matron, you're a matriarch. I am going
Mhm.
to show you the respect that you deserve. I don't love it.
Yeah, it reminds me of like, isn't there a verse that talks about like their gray hair is
Yes, is their
their
crown of
crown of
glory.
glory? Yeah.
And it's attained by a righteous life. Yes, I love that side of it.
Yeah. So that's humbling for me. I need to remember not to
Yes, Your
be,
Highness. Ma'am
the
means Your
vanity
Highness.
of thinking it means I'm old needs to
Uh-huh.
be replaced by just the privilege of
For
being
sure. I mean, like
given
picture Queen
respect.
Elizabeth. It was like she wasn't trying to hide the fact that she was old,
Mm-mm.
but she was very respected and she
Yeah.
had such an elegance and such a dignity, you know?
Yeah.
Nobody's going to look at Queen Elizabeth and be like, "Ooh, she really let herself go." Like that's not the way they
That's
treat her.
right. That's right. Well, so getting back to what I love about being in my 40s is I feel like I am definitely, as I get older, I care less
Hmm.
about what people think. And I have in the past been crippled by my people pleasing and worry about what people think. I do feel like as I look back, there are times when I look back on things I did or said, even in my 30s, even in my 20s, just looking back, even last year.
Even
And
yesterday.
I think, what was I thinking? And
Right.
then so the idea of maturing, becoming more mature in my
Yeah.
thinking, becoming more open-minded in terms of not giving up theology that
Right.
is carved in stone theology, but
Hmm.
realizing how much of just kind of working my faith out in ways that I
Yeah.
think I'm growing in ways where I had held on so tightly to tradition
Right.
or to cultural understandings of things that
Hmm.
I feel like God is growing me in my ability. I feel like my faith is strengthening, which allows me to explore my theology in a way that is not scared.
I totally get that. It's the difference. Like it would not weird me out like it would have like our first year of marriage to tell Scott if I thought an actor was a handsome person. Do you know what I
Right.
mean?
Mm-hmm.
Because
There you
we are
go.
so solid in the fact that
Mm-hmm.
I'm never going to leave him for some Hollywood actor
Right.
that it's totally fine for me to mention to him in passing, like, yeah, like I'll even tell him this sometimes, like, I like this guy because he kind of reminds me of you. Like, I think I have a type and Scott fits my type. And so, like I could even bring it up that, but if we were brand new married and he told me like, I loved this movie because she's so hot, like that would have felt very, very threatening to
Right.
me. And I mean, of course, if he put it in those terms today, it would hurt my feelings. Like, I don't want him to call her hot, you know, but he could say, yeah, when I was young, I really liked her. I had a huge crush on her. That
Mm-hmm.
means zero to me in terms of, am I threatened that my husband's going to leave me for, some 80s pop star or something like that.
I love that. I love that analogy between that and our
Hmm.
faith. It's that same
Yeah.
confidence. And yeah,
Hmm.
there's really not a lot that rattles me anymore in terms of possibilities. So I don't know.
Right.
Yeah, I do feel like my relationship with God has deepened.
Hmm.
There are times that I feel like, man, I'm 48. I would have thought that I would have been way more together as a Christian by now
Hmm. Hmm.
in some areas. So there are areas where I
Hmm.
still kind of think that, but I think the area that matters, which is my direct relationship with God, I do feel like there's a security there that I like. I like the analogy to a marriage
Yeah.
that's secure.
Yeah. Well, I am excited to hear what is great about your 50s and 60s and 70s, and I'm excited. If you're one of our older listeners and you wanna share with us what we can look forward to in our 50s and beyond, please leave us a comment. And how about
Hmm.
this? Let's close with what would you love to tell our younger listeners just about maybe faith and aging and all the stuff we've been talking about?
Wow. Okay. I would say, and maybe this is geared more towards people that are more of a like input strength on the Clifton
Okay.
strengths.
Uh-huh.
But I would say, learn, there's so much information out there. Learn about the biology if you're interested, but learn about the
Hmm.
biology of womanhood and of your cycle.
Hmm.
Not to the point of Googling yourself into thinking you have stuff, but just to find out how
Hmm.
your cycle works. Don't be afraid
Yeah.
to learn about the inner workings, because the body and the mind and the spirit are so intertwined that
Hmm.
learning about how your body works can really help every aspect of your life. So learn about your cycle, learn about, the vitamins your body needs, things like that, because that
Yeah.
has really helped me. And I had
Hmm.
always compartmentalized my physical and my
Right. This is
spiritual.
my body and this is my spirit, and
Yeah.
never the two shall meet. It's
Yeah.
kind of, yeah.
Yeah,
But
so I
no,
would
they are
definitely
all.
say, yeah, don't be afraid. Like learn about your body, and that can apply to other things. And I also think, just in terms of your relationship with God, not to be afraid to question, but always question in God's
Hmm.
presence. And so that is
Yes.
what I have loved, is anytime I have a question
Hmm.
about my faith or doubts about my faith, it's so freeing to finally like stick your toe in the cold water of questioning after
Yeah.
years of feeling like, if I
Hmm.
don't believe this, this, and this, and this, like my
Right.
church has always told me,
Right.
if you have questions outside of that, always do it within the confines of a conversation with God.
Hmm.
And I just feel like that is the safest, most fulfilling thing that I've done in
Yeah.
terms of the questions that inevitably come when you come from kind of that I don't know how old you would be in that transition, however you
Hmm.
are, from taking a faith that has been given to you and then
Right.
establishing it as your own in
Yeah.
young adulthood.
Yeah. Oh, that's beautiful.
How about you?
Well, I need to share a story. This goes back to our episode where we talked about my ankle and how
Hmm.
much I was struggling with it. And at that time, I was not ready to like say I love my ankle because I was still just really upset at the way that it was kind of like
Yeah.
felt like it was messing up so much of my
Betraying
life.
you, it
Yes.
felt like that, like a betrayal.
And the day a couple days ago I told you about where I started crying, it was all kind of related to that. I was thinking about when I traveled, it really drove home. Like my hearing's gotten even worse than it was when I first got my hearing aids.
Hmm.
And it's very embarrassing. Like I think I told you, like hearing the gate agent pick up the microphone and say, and I looked over, I'm like, what is he doing? And he's actually speaking English words and I just can't hear him.
Yeah.
So I was thinking about that. It had been like a stress. It was a wonderful trip, but traveling is stressful for me anyway. We
Oh
had this
yeah.
big snowstorm that made it really scary getting to the airport from Anchorage. So there was just, a lot of stress. And then I was thinking about my hearing, and then I was thinking about my ankle, and I was just sobbing my eyes out. But what happened was I was so flooded with, and this is going to sound weird to a lot of people. I loved my body more in that moment than I ever have, like in my entire
Oh,
life. And that is
wow.
what I would love to wish for listeners from 20 to 100,
Hmm.
is that no matter how, because it was just like, it was morning, like, I am so sorry that you don't work as well as you did a few years ago. That must be
Oh,
so sad for you. Like it's hard for me, but it must be really sad for you, right? Like
wow.
picturing my body as kind of, here's me and here's my body.
Yeah, that's a
And
breakthrough.
what I would really love to wish for all listeners of all ages is that no matter what your body's doing at this moment, that you would experience that same love for your body. Like how many women can say, I love my body? And most of the time, if you heard those women, you would expect them to say, I love the shape of my body, or I
Mhm.
love the way I look in a swimsuit, or I love how I look in the mirror. And that's not what I'm talking about at all. Like, I love this package that God has wrapped my soul in, and that allows me to interact with the world and allows me to have conversations with you and to podcast and to smell fresh air and like all of these things. I love the fact that I have a body, and I love the body that I have. And that would be my wish. That's a hard thing for a lot of people to get to, where they could say that, because so much of being a woman today is tied up in, there's almost rituals about, let's all hate our bodies together and let's all talk about, all the facets of ourselves that we dislike and things like that. And so I would love for, yeah, for every one of you to just be overcome by that love and gratitude for the body that God has given you, no matter what degree it's functioning at the moment.
Amen.
Amen. And we will see you all next time.